So hi everyone, I'm here with Natalie Murray today, who's one of the co-owners of Lawbox Design. And Lawbox Design are a legal firm and they specialise in financial services and financial services law. Natalie, thanks very much for joining me. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Hi, nice to meet you.
So I thought first off it'd be good just to talk a bit about what are some of the things that I suppose are on the agenda for this year from a legal point of view and from a regulatory point of view. I mean, if you were to sort of hit some of the highlights you think that we've got to be thinking about now, or you're thinking about now with clients, I suppose.
Yeah, so I guess there's quite a wide range of things that we have to think about this year. I guess the data adequacy following Brexit is one of the big ones. IR35 is coming up. And that's just out there. From an FCA perspective, it's kind of the vulnerability side of, people owing money, so debtors, I suppose, particularly in the fields of buy now, pay later. I suppose those are the things that come to mind straight away.
Yeah. So one of the things that came out recently was the vulnerability review. The FCA came out with some stuff really around vulnerability. I mean, how do you think that's going to play through? I mean, a lot of this was already in place at a lot of the big players as being sort of like best practice. But do you think that's going to be a lot of changes that come through as a result of that? Now the regulators sort of issued the guidance.
Yeah. So I guess for this, I think you've said exactly that this isn't new stuff. This has always been best practice, and most of the firms that I've seen have this in their internal policies and processes. I guess the difference now will be that it's on the FCA's radar. We're living through a time that's pretty difficult for people, so it will be a case of them making sure that people have these in place. And I guess the work for industry is to check those processes that they have in place already. Maybe perform mini audits internally to make sure that they are in line with those, and maybe to just refresh them.
And the fact that it's written as guidance, does that now mean that the regulator's got much more teeth to then go after people or to advise people or to audit people than it was before? I mean, does it change the sense of it? Whereas before it's almost like this is best practice, we're doing it for the right reasons. Now we're still doing it for the right reasons, but now the regulator can come in and sort of and look at us for it, which just has a different connotation, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I guess it does give the regulator teeth to be able to say you must change this, or you're doing this wrong, essentially. But I think it's always one of those strange conversations you have with clients from legal in best practice and guidance and what is actually the difference internally in terms of the business. And I guess that's all the stakeholders have to make that decision. Mostly what I see is they want to follow best practice anyway. But I guess it comes down to the fact that the regulator can come in, do an on-the-spot visit, make sure that the processes are in place, and then give you fairly hefty kind of, ultimately fines, but actually sit with you and make sure that you remedy those things you're not doing right.
I mean, I thought it would be quite interesting from a vulnerability point of view. I mean, obviously, it feels like it's going to be a theme, particularly when you look at the back of the pandemic, and it felt like it was almost like lines being drawn in the sand a little bit around making sure that you need to make sure you're treating people fairly with everything that's going on in the background. Yeah,
and I think it's maybe one of the positives that we can take from the pandemic, that actually that line has been drawn, because this has always been an issue in the industry, and good lenders have always paid attention. But I guess now what they've done is say, look, everybody, this is industry wide. We've got to look after people, and this is how we suggest you do it. And sometimes just that guidance or that best practice, however it comes out, is good, because it forces or allows business to make those right decisions. Stakeholders pay attention, and what we find is there's always something to do, and perhaps this takes it up the ladder a little bit.
No one's ever not busy, it seems like, these days. One of the lines that caught me, that I caught in the report, was a piece around digital vulnerability, which I thought was kind of interesting. And I had a few conversations around that recently, which I think has been interesting. And it's almost like that was almost like a new thing that's come up. So originally we had vulnerability around medical issues. We've had mental health being awareness. We've had gambling that's come through. And it almost feels like, well, digital vulnerability, and it's almost, does that link to almost like access for all, as making sure that no one's left behind. And I thought that's quite relevant in terms of potentially relevant in terms of what's happened with the pandemic, because now everything's going digital. I don't know whether you feel is that a theme, do you think?
I think it is generally across industry. You know, we've all gone digital in one form or another, and I guess we have to do that. With the FCA has to kind of go and touch upon that subject, how that will actually look, and the effect that it will take. I wonder whether it's more of a box ticking exercise from their part to acknowledge the fact that we have this this extra area that we've got to cover, rather than anything else is yet to be seen. But I think that we had to kind of go there, because that is in line with what we're doing everywhere else.
Yeah. The other thing that's coming up this year, I suppose, is the breathing space legislation that came out of the Moratorium that came out, primary legislation that came out last year, and that's due to go live this year, if I get it correct. I mean, that's sort of gradually been rolling out across the industry and sort of doing the work in the background. But I mean, how do you think that will roll out, and what do you think people want to think through from a legal point of view?
Yes, that's something that we've been doing in industry, and people have been offering that up, but it's very much a choice from the lender's perspective, and they'll have their own parameters and internal processes they've decided. Whereas this is much more formal. This is what it is, and actually it's I am interested in seeing how this will look for the individual debtors, because the formality of the process, whilst it looks like it's better for them, I wonder whether that's going to be a barrier for them actually doing anything about it.
Right.
But actually, the thing I see from industry is that once you have gone through this process as the debtor, and you are sort of accepted as being vulnerable in that way, the notice then goes out formally to all the creditors, and they've got a specific amount of time by which to sort of address that. And I wonder whether we need to be prepared for that. Yeah. Because there will be, kickback from industry if we're not attending to that as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and so do you think people are ready for it, or I mean, because the deadline's sort of coming up pretty quick, and there's been some work, there's been quite a lot of work, but there's also been quite a lot of varying opinion around what needs to be done versus what doesn't need to be done, and how much will be the same versus actually being different.
Yeah, I think it's the same thing. When we had GDPR. And you had this huge piece of legislation coming in with a whole heap of a giant workload to get through. And I guess the way that we always deal with this is we look at the priorities. What are the biggest changes that we need to make in the business, through to the things that we're already doing. I guess it depends across the industry. I can think of a couple of people that may struggle with it. And it's the industry is already busy doing everything else. So I think it's going to be tricky for those.
Yeah.
But I guess for those already doing this in some form or another, it's just a case of revising what they're doing, auditing, how this is going to work in practice, and making sure that they hit the required guidelines.
And some of the conversations I've had elsewhere, I mean, it's usually the edge cases, it's the unusual cases. That's where you have the problem as much as like the bulk of it, right? And it's how do you sort of navigate that? And those tend to be the unusual, like complex, even the legal cases or legal questions, right? And that's always where the nuances seem to come in. It felt like a little bit.
No, and I think that's right. And you're never really going to get, it's really hard to get a definitive position. But so long as you can defend what the position you take. So we take a bunch of use cases, we identify what the issues are with those, and we try to create a position where we can sort of put it into a policy and processes across the business. And then what you do is you try to audit that as you go. So as and when these use cases come up and they're outside of those parameters, that's when you kind of take a step back as the business and decide, well, wait a minute, how many of these are we missing? And we need to make sure that we address these somehow. And I guess it's just the process. You've got to keep those up to date and keep those discussions going on.
So you mentioned GDPR, and I'm not going to go back to GDPR, but I am going to talk about data sharing. And so since Brexit, we've become a third country. The UK has become a third country since Brexit. Data sharing was part of that. And I know there's discussions really around equivalence, wasn't there, in terms of like whether we could still share data back into the EU and for EU citizens here. I mean, what's the latest on that?
Yeah, so GDPR was a funny one, because when this did come out, I mean, it scared a huge number of businesses. And actually what it did is it didn't change a whole heap of things that we were already or should have been doing anyway. With data adequacy, we've got a draft decision to suggest that the UK will be an adequate adequate space for data sharing, but that's not quite confirmed yet. So we're waiting for that confirmation. And what that does actually is that puts us in a really nice place where businesses are not having to create contractual clauses between, say, a UK business and an EU entity to ensure the data flow is safe. You know, I think if without the adequacy decision, it would have created a whole heap of work for business. And I'm hoping that what we'll essentially get is business as usual with our decision.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the way data is distributed everywhere these days, and I mean, all that stuff sort of sits in the background. Normally, we sort of take it for granted, but it could have put a bit of a spanner in the works, it felt like.
Well, that's exactly the key. So we've all created businesses, growing businesses, and we use contractors, you know, all sorts across EU and elsewhere. And it's felt like a natural process for industry to evolve in that way. And then all of a sudden, you have to take a step back and review perhaps all of those arrangements, and then put in place contractual clauses to cover the data flow. Yeah. And I think for certain business that would have been a huge task. Actually, what it's saying is between the EU and the UK, nothing now is going, hopefully, provided this goes through, nothing now will change, and we're considered safe harbour for data. Yeah. The thing to think about that is every 4 years that decision gets reviewed. So it's not like we're kind of out of the woods forever. We just need to keep an eye on that and make sure that we do everything right, so that we stay within the parameters. And so
it also sounds like it might be prudent just to think about what could some of the other outcomes be and sort of get ready for some of those now. So if something does change, that you've got the structures in place instead of being like a panic at the last minute, even if we get an extra 4 years.
Yeah, no, exactly. And the thing that I think is really good to think about, and all the time, and this should be an ongoing piece of work as part of your compliance role in business, is to have a data flow. To know what happens with your data when it comes in from customers and when it goes out to, say, contractors or anything else, and to keep that live. And to make sure that somebody in the business understands what's going on there. And for me, that's, you know, having worked with industry, that's half of the battle, trying to pin down what the data is doing. Yeah. Once you have that, the legals can kind of wrap around that fairly. Yeah. It's not such a difficult process.
Yeah, it's all about getting the process right.
Exactly.
So contractors is an interesting discussion as well. So IR35 legislation, which was already in place for public sector, but was due to go live, I think last year, wasn't it? And that they got rolled over to this year. So April's the new deadline for IR35. You know, so I know some people have already been moving towards like different contracts, and it's certainly for contractors, it's going to have quite a big impact. It feels like. I mean, have you seen work on that? I mean, what's your kind of view on that in terms of that rolling out?
Yeah. So the funny thing is, last year this came up a lot, and people were actually preparing for it to come in last year. So it's a real mixed bag of those that have already prepared and put their sort of set their stall out, and those that decided to wait. The difficulty with this is in the private sector now, because of course the public sector has already seen this. It puts the onus on the business and the contractor to make a decision and to decide whether or not they're a contractor in its pure form or should actually be an employee. You know, they're actually an employee with a contractor wrapper. Yeah. Which is tricky actually, because the rules aren't that clear on what that looks like. But essentially, what we're being asked to do is to put together a determination status for each contractor that we have, and that's a document that you both agree as contractor and as company, and you go through the questions that and these are quite nice documents that are quite easy to read and to use, and you determine whether, in your opinion, you think IR35 catches you or not. So, are you a contractor, or actually should you be an employee? Now that document, it has to be in writing, which is why that document works really well. And it means you have those discussions, you ask those simple questions to get to the answer. But essentially what that does is kind of your defensible position in deciding what IR35 or where it puts you as maybe an individual contractor.
I think it's going to be quite a big change, and I suppose some of the larger banks had already gone to like everyone's inside IR35. You know, and so it felt like some of that change has already gone through, but I suppose the deadline's still there, and I suppose we'll see how it sort of, you know, the teeth of it starts next month, really, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So I think for smaller businesses, or actually where this will hit will be the one-man band sort of, in its true form, a contractor who maybe has a service company that works for 2 or 3 firms, and perhaps they're stuck in that place where for the current time, for the moment, they're just working for one firm, which questions their status as contractor rather than employee. Now that might be just because that's the job they've taken for now, whereas sometimes they've got 2 roles going on. But they have to be very careful there not to fall into the basket. You know, so make sure they keep their status up to date and the forms, completed and true and accurate.
The next thing I want to ask about was a little bit about the Woollard review that came out, and I think it was the review on unsecured lending. So there's quite a lot of play about that in the press around, particularly around the buy now pay later sector. So that's a sector that's seen huge growth since the pandemic's kind of started, and I think there's a lot of concern around the fact it was being unregulated and whether you should have some of the same controls that you'd have under the secured lending kind of market.
Yeah.
So it felt like there was some guidance that came out around that sector, which now looks it's going to come under the FCA. But I suppose it was just asking from your point of view, I suppose, what did you think of that? And then particularly if there's any thoughts around what are some of the things they've got to now think about from a buy now pay later sector point of view?
Yeah, so I think this has been, it's been long awaited actually for both lenders and for the for debtors, for customers. The sector itself is an odd one because it's grown even before the pandemic. We all kind of see that buy now pay later, and everybody is, I wouldn't say a victim to it, but I would choose to do that because why not? It seems like a good option. But actually what you don't see is almost the small print, and it's the one sector that seems to still have that small print, whereby you would say have 12 months where it's interest free, but if you don't pay within that 12 months, then actually what you're doing at month 13 is you're repaying the interest from months 1 to 12 anyway. So it kind of penalises people without actually mentioning that it does that, unless you're a lawyer looking at the terms. And why that doesn't really fit is because, I've been a consumer credit lawyer for more years than I can remember. And if you draft a secured or regulated agreement, there are certain things that we have to put in it to make sure that people are aware of what the terms say. So because you're a consumer, we'll tell you and we'll be nice about, what we're saying to you, what you're signing up to. And this space hasn't touched upon that. So now what we're saying is actually we can't, we're going to have to be clear to people. This is still a service that people want. This is an offering that they obviously like. So we're not going to take it away, but let's tell them what this actually means. That's one of the things that we have to do as lenders within the industry. We've also got to start to tell them, well, look, you're at 11 months now. If you don't get this paid in the next month, you're going to pay interest on this. And it's kind of a big warning sign. It may not change how many people sign up to it, and it may not change the nature of people going into months 13 and 14 and paying more interest. But what it does do is it means they enter into those sorts of arrangements knowing what they're doing.
And do you think that's going to put barriers in terms of accessibility to that kind of those kind of services? I mean, so speed of checkout and sort of like frictionless journeys has been a big sort of thing that's come through with it. I mean, do you think it's going to add friction to that kind of journey?
I think it will initially because they're very speedy as they currently stand. And anything you put is always going to be a barrier to add an extra wording, to put some extra word in that has to be kind of seen by the customer. But I think the industry is getting there anyway with all the other things that you have to do. I think it will hit those players that just deal in this industry. Yes, I think they'll have to make some changes. But for those that have this as their extra offering, I think they're quite well prepared to deal with those changes anyway.
I mean, some of them have got regulated lines as well as non-regulated lines. I'm thinking of a couple. I mean, so they're probably a little bit more up to speed than those that don't. And the affordability assessment, I suppose, is the other piece that was sort of coming through, and so making sure you do that, because that's been mandated from an FCA point of view, is making sure you're doing that acquisition. Then we have all the challenge around I&E and collections and recoveries and those kind of things. So I mean, all of that has to be built in now, does it?
It does, yeah. And that, going back to when that was first introduced, that was a really tough one, because what does that mean? We have to do these things, but to what extent do we have to do them? And who clears that, who actually signs off and says that is acceptable practice? So I think the industry has had to learn along the way and trial and error this a little bit. And I don't think this will be any different to that. We've got our rules, we've got the things that we have to do, but we've also got the balance that we have to do to make this product still accessible, because that's how it works. It's still a requirement, it's still wanted.
And how do you think that will roll out from a regulator point of view? Will they just say now you have to be licensed? I mean, do you think that's what's going to happen, or will it sort of be more sort of like slowly introduced?
I guess the way that it ordinarily works is they'll give a date by which everybody has to be licensed, and they'll try to roll it out in terms of industry sectors or particular sectors within the people offering this up. So for those that are they've got a mixed bag of regulated and unregulated book, they'll probably be first in the queue because that's an easy win, I guess. Those that are wholly unregulated doing this, it will be a harder task for them because. And I guess you'll see what we saw with consumer credit. You'll have a dropout rate because people cannot justify becoming regulated if they aren't already.
Yeah.
And then you'll get the bigger players coming through, getting their license, fairly quickly.
Yeah, I think some of them have already got licenses. I think some of them have, and I remember when the first time when the FCA authorization came around, and everyone had to go through it, even the biggest banks, right? And it was just like everyone was going through it. You could sort of see everyone mapping everything and going through everything and trying to making the applications and everything. It was a fun time. So one of the things I didn't ask about was around letters. So obviously, we are, letters are part of the Consumer Credit Act. They're something that very much sort of mandated, and there's a lot of focus in the industry really around letters and the wording, and they have to be done. But we're all working digitally now, and I mean, do you think that's going to evolve? How that's going to evolve with sort of like more automated forms and those kind of things?
Yeah, this is one of those kind of those things that I keep an eye on because I'm fascinated to know when the FCA will take that step and suggest that we don't need paper form letters. But of course, the Consumer Credit Act is so old. It's been updated over the years, but actually it still kind of doesn't work for the industry and how we've evolved. So I'm really looking forward to that being updated. I think it's an odd one because I always think that sending a letter through someone's mailbox is more scary. It's worse, if they're in debt and having difficulties, those arrears letters that you have to send through are pretty scary to look at. But actually, the purpose behind them is not for that. They're supposed to help and to give the right amount of information and at the right time. So I think there's some real work to be done by the regulators there in updating how we as consumers see these, but also how we deal with things day to day. And generally speaking, I mean, the post that we get is reducing. Yeah. So I think we need to take that on board.
Speaking of the Consumer Credit Act, do you think that when will that ever get? I mean, the original one was what, 1973? I mean, are we due for an update?
Yes, absolutely we are. And I hear rumours about this every year. They talk about it, and it's something it's on their list of things to do, and it will happen. But of course, there's other things. They're kind of picking away at the edges, I think, with the thematic reviews. And then you've, of course, had the year that we've had, so everything has been put on hold. But I can see this myself in the next 5 years, I think.
I'm just thinking about the moratorium legislation that came through the breathing space. There's quite a nice, interesting interplay between, I suppose, government and primary legislation, and then you've got the FCA and the regulator, and like, where do they overlap? Where do they not overlap? How do they work out the kinks of where things overlap between them? I mean, you must watch that with interest, I would think.
Oh, it's like it's one of those things. It's fascinating to me, and lots of people wouldn't be interested in so much. But it changed our day to day and how we do things as consumers. They're talking about that very thing, and the FCA will come in and they'll have our interests at heart. But actually, sometimes I question whether they know what's going on the ground actually, and what consumers really want. And then you've got the government trying to look after everybody. You've got legislation that sort of comes in with big size 10s and stamps all over everything we've already done. And it's finding that balance between doing the right thing and bringing down the pieces of legislation, what it's intended to do, but making it really practical and to benefit people.
Yeah, and I suppose some of it you have this broad brush approach versus almost like a very fine point approach, which sort of addresses individual issues, but you need the broad brush to provide the almost like the infrastructure to be able to do it. But it's not perfect. It's never perfect.
No. No, it isn't, and that's industry find it. It's really hard work sometimes to work out what is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Because there are times when you'll take some guidance, and if you followed all of it to the letter, you wouldn't have a business anymore. In certain sectors, so you've got to find a way for you, and you've got to and you've also got to follow the rules. It can be really tricky.
The other question I have, I suppose, is more on a business point of view, really, which is, I mean, how have you guys found in terms of like working remotely, and how's that sort of affected your kind of business and the business that you guys do? I mean, because obviously you spend a lot of time talking with clients and then being on site with clients. I mean, how's that kind of affected the dynamics?
Yeah, so it's a tricky one, because we're set up as a remote practice. So in theory, it shouldn't have affected us at all. But actually, we go and visit clients' offices, we work with clients, we meet people all the time. So I think that's had a personal kind of effect on all of everyone that works here, because we're now stuck in our home offices. We're doing things like this on screen a lot. You're not getting the day-to-day interaction with people.
Yeah.
It has meant actually that we can spend some time really getting to know clients. So because we aren't traveling, we spend that extra time on Zoom calls or Skype calls, and we can spend some extra time on the work. We've also got that lovely work-life balance thing going on, where you've either got children at home, or you've got parents that you have to look after, or whatever it might be for you, and we've been able to balance that out a bit. So there's lots of things we could kind of moan about, I expect, but on the whole, I think we've managed okay, and we've certainly seen the benefits of that coming through.
I mean, I kind of find that sometimes being at home and doing these kind of calls, you obviously get all the commute time or the traveling time back in your diary, but you also get more sort of quiet time to concentrate and get things done, right? So it's almost like that stuff increases, but then what you lose on that is then the relationship side of things, in terms of meeting people and having a bit of a laugh, and that's also important as well.
It's massively important, actually, and for the people that we work with, so for our own contractors and for the people that help us out sort of in our hub, but obviously they're with us at the moment, they're at home. It's really tricky to get that office banter vibe, because you just can't do it. It doesn't work. And equally with our clients, we've had to find a new way to make those jokes, because they don't quite cost the same on email or online. So I think everybody's kind of found a way, but I also think that people are looking forward to being able to meet in person again and have those social interactions that we've had previously.
So what do you think the future will hold? Will it be sort of like us doing a bit of a hybrid model, or do you think we'll all rush back to the office? It feels to me very much like there's definite pressure for us to go back in the office now, sort of coming up more than it was, whereas before it was all like, oh, everyone's going to be at home forever. And you can sort of like see much more of a balanced kind of argument coming back, and with probably pressure to go back a little bit. But I mean, what's your view on how it's going to sort of play out?
Yeah, so I think the staff will actually, want to go back to offices, but I think it will be a hybrid model. So I think what people will actually do, and what I'm hearing is, we'll have meeting days where everybody's in the office, and when we're all allowed, and you meet in person, you have nice lunches together, and then you'll have maybe a working day or two at home, where there's no phone calls, no meetings, and you'll just
get stuff done.
Because we have to do the work. But we talk about this in theory. In practice, I can already think about how that won't work in some ways. But I think the nice thing about what we've been through, and a positive to take from it, is that lots of firms and employers were not that keen on people working from home. And it's been a real push for workers to spend more time at home or in their own offices. And I think we found that we can actually do it. And our productivity levels have been quite high. So I'm hoping that for employers, certainly it ticks the box and allows them to have a bit more, or maybe to be a bit more relaxed about that in future.
Yeah. I mean, I love the fact you can be in different places, almost like teleport to different places, almost like instantly. So you can have a conversation with someone in Cornwall, and then you can be talking to someone in Scotland, and it can just be back to back sort of thing. And it's just and you can sort of you don't have to travel, right? So which I think adds one layer of value, but I'd say obviously you miss the face to face kind of interaction a little bit.
Definitely.
So from a regulatory point of view and from a legal point of view, I mean, what do you think the next sort of 6 months, years going to hold? I mean, what are the things we should have on our radar screen?
So IR35 is definitely one of those. The very close to hopefully being resolved is the data adequacy decision, and I'm hoping that will be a nice win pretty quickly. But I think from a FCA point of view, it's vulnerability. We're going to have a lot of people that need to be looked after. So I think for lenders and for industry, we've just got to make sure that, you know, the breathing space, all of these things that the FCA are talking about, we actually stand up and pay attention.
Yeah.
We perhaps don't relax on our morals and think we've got that in place, we're okay. Perhaps we review those policies we've got to make sure that they align with what the FCA are doing, but actually align with what industry expect from us. I think there's going to be, as always, some of the scams out there to catch these people as well. And I think the FCA are sort of ready to take action if they need to.
Well, I think it's going to be an interesting time, certainly as we come out of the pandemic. And I thought, obviously, there's an interaction between the government and the borrowers and the lenders, and everyone sort of interacts there. And I think it's almost like everything's been thrown up in the air during the pandemic, and sort of like things feel like they're starting to land a little bit. But I expect there'll probably be more. I'm expecting to be still more changes as sort of things start to settle a little bit. Yeah,
no, I think that's the key, and I think the more you can just keep an eye on these things, ask the right questions, you know, speak to the people with that knowledge, and it doesn't. Maybe you are in a good place, but just asking that question and checking those things is probably good to do.
Good. Well, Natalie, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. It's been great to chat with you.
No, you're welcome. Thank you.
Okay.